Welcome. Welcome to Massey Dialogues 20 years after 9/11. My name is Nathalie Des Rosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome you here. Massey College, not the virtual college, but the real college, is built on indigenous lands, the lands of the Yolngu, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and the great privilege that we have to be here to do our work. So welcome you all. So today is a very special day at Massey College because we welcome the former mayor from Calgary, Naheed Nenshi. We're delighted to have you here. It's really nice to have you at Massey. I understand you've been to Massey before, but we're really excited to have you here for this very special dialogue. So I will introduce my three guests in order, and then we'll begin the dialogue. So Naheed Nenshi doesn't need any introduction, but let me just point out a couple things. So obviously, he served as mayor of Calgary for 3 terms from 2010 to 2021. His leadership saw an unprecedented investment in transportation, infrastructure. He's no stranger to stress and emergency, 4 states of emergencies in Calgary during his term, and he has been named the best mayor in the world in 2014, and he holds the Master of Public Policy degree from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And he's been a delight to see you here at Massey, so welcome.
Merci.
We'll have also, following him, Haroon Siddiqui, who's no stranger to Massey College. He's a senior fellow since 2001. He's the former columnist and editorial page editor at the Toronto Star, Canada's largest newspaper. He's reported on the state of Canada for 50 years, has written from more than 50 countries. He was the former president of PEN Canada, and is a member of the board of PEN International. He's also a distinguished professor at Ryerson University. Holds both the Order of Canada and the Order of Ontario. Merci, Haroon. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And we are joined by Ulrike Al-Khamis, who is the new CEO of the Aga Khan Museum. She's an internationally renowned scholar in the field of Islamic art and culture, and over 25 years of experience in curating and advising on cultural projects. She served in the Middle East. She holds a PhD in Islamic art from the University of Edinburgh, where she actually co-curated many fabulous exhibits. She was the co-director of the Sajal Museum of Islamic Civilization. And I am so happy that you're here with us today. And let's begin. I want to begin with you, Mr. Nenshi. About 20 years ago, any reflections on what has been the impact of on the Muslim community for the last 20 years?
Well, merci Nathalie, thank you for having me here today. I'm starting a new business, by the way, masks that are also pocket squares. So far I've had 0 sales. Bonjour tout le monde, Oki Nitsukwa. Greetings to all my relations, Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be here. This is probably the longest stretch during this pandemic that I have not visited Toronto, the city of my birth. So it is wonderful to be back here with you all at Massey College, to be having this important conversation. And I think what I'll try to do is weave together a broader conversation around the concept of equity and how we've seen that change over the last 20 years, and then talk a little bit about Islamophobia.
Yeah.
Because I think that we have 2 kind of contradictory things that have happened since 2001. On the one hand, we have a lot more knowledge about Islam. We've moved in a lot of forward direction in terms of the acceptance of the Muslim reality here in North America and Canada in particular. The oldest mosque in North America is just north of me in a city I sometimes forget exists called Edmonton. And of course we have had an Islamic fact here in Canada as long as there has been a Canada. And I think over the last 20 years, a lot of folks have really tried hard to learn more to increase their own knowledge about what that truly means. So that's a good thing. It's not all good, though.
Yep.
And what we have in particular seen over the last several years is a real increase in Islamophobia, in religious bigotry of all kinds, anti-Semitism, other forms of religious bigotry. And as I always say when I'm speaking to Muslim audiences, if we are fighting Islamophobia, we must also be fighting anti-Semitism. We have to be working against bigotry in all its forms. Hate crimes have increased significantly over the last few years, and often it feels like we're living in a world of great division and despair, of mean-spiritedness and of anger. So what's one to do? On the one hand, it is much more common to see a woman wearing hijab in the community than it may have been 20 years ago. On the other hand, women who wear hijabis will often say, I feel less comfortable now than I did before because I'm worried about what will happen to me. And I think when we take that in the context of what we've been through together in the last couple of years around Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, we realize that there's something important here that we haven't quite gotten right. And this is hard for Canadians, very hard, because we are smug about pluralism and about multiculturalism and on what we have created here. You know, I served on the jury for the Global Pluralism Prize at the Global Center for Pluralism. I was on that jury precisely because I was Canadian, because we needed a Canadian other than the chair to be on the jury. So we're very proud of that, right? And certainly for 11 years in public life, I spent a lot of time around the world talking about Canada as a place where pluralism and multiculturalism and diversity works as a model for the world. Yet last summer, we had these conversations around Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, around religious bigotry. And at Calgary, we had for the first time a public hearing for 3 days where we just invited people to come and tell us their stories. It was a very interesting situation because the members of City Council who were white were by and large very surprised by the stories they were hearing. The members who were not were not. And in the history of Calgary City Council, up until October 18th, a month ago, in the entire history of Calgary City Council, there had been 7 non-white members of City Council, of whom 4 served on my last council, including me. And I'm sure all of you are following Calgary politics incredibly carefully, but you will know, because you've been following it so carefully, that we now have 5 members of City Council, including our new mayor, who are people of color. So things are shifting slowly. But my point is that I had to stop and think hard, because I'm hearing all these stories of how people are having racism in the community. And I wasn't surprised. And then I stopped and asked myself, why am I not surprised? Because I'm old. And so if 20-year-olds are telling me about their experiences trying to go to a restaurant or a bar, and they're the same as they were when I was that age, why haven't we moved forward? And so I want to hear from everyone else, obviously, so I'll just wrap up with a thought, which is this makes me really uncomfortable, but I think we have to have 2 things in our heads at the same time. The one is it's okay to be proud of what we built. It really is an exceptional place. But it's okay to also understand that our path from the pluralism and diversity that we are rightly proud of to true anti-racism, I don't know what that journey looks like, and I don't know what the destination is. But I think of anywhere in the world that is set to make that journey, Canada is the place we want to be.
Well, let me follow up a little bit with Haroon and bring it to Islamophobia, the 20 years, the journey of your 20 years reflecting on this issue, and we've had occasion to talk about it on several forums over the years. Where are you today?
No, I'm like Naheed. I'm an incurably optimistic Canadian, and I want to think of good things of Canada, but our record is not all that clean since 2011, unfortunately. If you want to look at the overall situation in a broad context, 3,000 innocent Americans were murdered by terrorists on 9/11 who happened to be Muslim. But since then, 800,000 Muslims have been killed in the forever war on terror. Something like 30 million Muslims have been displaced. And there has been a racist disregard for Muslim lives, for Muslim suffering. And we are partially part of that. We did not cause all of it, but some of it is on our shoulders. That's one. Number two, we joined the Afghan war, which was the right thing to do. We did not join the Iraq war, which was the right thing to do. But then we ended up making the mistake of staying on too long in Afghanistan. We should not have gone to Kandahar for the combat mission. The Prime Minister made it clear he was doing it as a penance for not joining the Iraq war. And we know what the results have been. It has been clear that it was the wrong thing to have done. That's one. At the same time, in our care, 400 Afghan detainees were transferred to the Afghan authorities. We know between a quarter and a third of them were tortured, according to Amnesty International report and the BC Association of Civil Liberties.
Excuse me, could you speak a little louder, please?
Yeah, okay. So I was just saying that 400 Afghans were detained by Canadians and transferred to Afghan authorities, and a quarter and a third of them were tortured. That's on our conscience also. Then we went into Libya in 2011, which was a total disaster, which Mr. Obama, if you remember, said he's leading from the back. We were part of the bombing, and we collapsed that state, and we know what has happened. All the arms and armaments from Libya have gone all over Africa, and that mess is still being cleared. So that's the sort of war end of it.
Yes.
Yes, and we'll leave it there, and we can continue the discussion.
Well, no, I just want to bring it to Canada a little bit. So we have this bad consciousness, this weight on our shoulder about our international persona. And then we have it seems to translate in 20-year-olds that are in Calgary saying,
Yes.
I experienced racism. Is there a connection? Or do you see a connection in the hypocrisy? Or?
It's not so much hypocrisy. The connection really happens in a different area because there's a cultural warfare that has been waged on Islam and Muslims, including Canadian Muslims. And that emanates from the fact that every war needs propaganda. And propaganda requires telling lies, like the non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Propaganda also entails soft tactics, which is we are in Afghanistan to save Afghan women. Afghan women need saving, but we did not invade Afghanistan to save women. When you build propaganda and demonize the enemy, in this case, the Taliban or Saddam Hussein or whoever, or Muammar al-Gaddafi, once you do that, it is very difficult to separate the bad Muslims there from the Muslims here.
Yeah.
So you get this juxtaposition. If you're there saving Afghan women, and if Afghan men are misogynistic, maybe the Muslims here are also misogynistic.
So the collateral damage
Collateral
is here.
damage.
Is here.
So if we are saving Afghan women, we have to save Muslim women in Canada. Therefore, Quebec, ban on hijab.
Yeah.
We are going to fire you from your jobs if you wear a hijab. So this is our way of saving them. So this is a perversity of thinking that has happened. So this is not conscious hypocrisy, this is not conscious double standard, but it's the inevitable effect of all the propaganda that we have done and the cultural warfare that we continue to wage up to this day.
And Ulrike, if I want to bring you in, I know that, I mean, your job is to make Islamic art accessible, to create bridges between cultures and so on. Have you seen, is there more enthusiasm for that project, that building project, that bridging project, because the community feels that it's under attack?
It's not so much a matter of enthusiasm, it's a matter of urgency. And when I listen to Naheed and I listen to Haroon, it's actually about the stories. Stories and narratives. Margaret Atwood, if I may paraphrase her, said, for every story that is told, many stories are not being told. So in my role as the director of the Aga Khan Museum in Canada, which of course is a museum that was explicitly given to Toronto as a haven for refugees, and Canada with its aspirations with regard to pluralism and building positive multi and intercultural societies, this aspect of stories and narratives is with me every single day of my working and actually personal life as well. Because when we look at how we tell stories, whether it be in the museum or in public life, we always need to be aware of the fact that we choose our stories. And if we want to make a difference, going back to what you said about why have we not moved forward, we need to change our storytelling. We need to open up the playing field for different, multifaceted, opposing, contrasting narratives. And we need to allow voices at the table that we would normally never consider even existing. When we talk about other cultures, and whether that's in the museum or in politics at large, we choose the voices that we allow to speak. And in a museum context, that is traditionally the curator's voice. Yeah. And if you go to an art museum, traditionally you have one label written by one curator with one story about the object. Now, if you take that as a metaphor for a people or a culture, then you also are accountable for all the stories that you are not telling. And when it comes, and I often think about this because I don't only work with another culture and within another culture and for other cultures, I should say, but I'm actually also married to another culture, and I have an Iraqi husband, 3 Scottish Cherokee kids because they were all born in Edinburgh, Scotland. So this thinking around whose stories are we allowing to be heard is with me in my daily life. Mm-hmm. And it's very important in the context of education, because when you look at curricula in schools, in universities, whether that is in our own backyard or it is in other parts of the world, in the Southern Hemisphere at large, in the Muslim world and beyond, you will see that the curricula are so Western-centric that you have a little Jordanian boy in the United Arab Emirates, just as an example, sitting an exam on Alfred the Great. Without knowing about his own background, his own roots, his own cultural and spiritual traditions. So we need to open up the stories and allow other voices in.
It's interesting to talk about narratives and the power of stories. Politicians always know that, that the narrative is, defines the day. But it was interesting that you started with the idea that people told their narratives, you know, opening up the city council for people to listen to others and listening to what's happening. Did you, and the idea of listening and being surprised by a little bit the constant narrative that Canadians have been telling themselves over the, you know, since the 60s, that we are the just society, we are the pluralist society, and so on. So that contradictions between narratives is essentially is what's happening. So you were optimistic, but what's the next step?
Well, I think there's a little bit of looking forward and a little bit of looking back. And in terms of looking back, we don't want to dwell on how we got here. But I think it is worth us understanding what of the forces that have led to the situation that we find ourselves in now, because it didn't just happen. And certainly, if you think back to our 2015 federal election, where a gentleman, I don't know whatever happened to him, oh yeah, he's the Premier of Alberta now, was going on and on about banning the niqab at citizenship ceremonies, which is, if you think about it, the most niche, tiny argument imaginable. It affected maybe a dozen women over 10 years, And the accommodation is an incredibly simple accommodation, which is you give your oath in private.
Yeah.
This is not hard.
Was
But
ridiculous.
somehow this became a massive issue in the election, and the Premier was recently asked about it. And you know, to the credit of Tim Upal, MP for Edmonton Millwoods, and to my city mate Michelle Rempel-Garner, they both have apologized for that and have talked about how they are embarrassed that this happened. The Premier, on the other hand, says, oh, he never was in favor of a niqab ban. I seem to recall him getting mad at me in interviews saying things about that. He said he was never in favor of niqab ban. Ban, right? He emphasized the final word. We got to come to terms with that. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. And we've got to understand that barbaric cultural practices, that the niqab ban, that was actually very deliberate political engineering.
Yeah.
It was on purpose. It was a dog whistle made audible. And I'll tell you why. I don't mind being that blunt. I'm out of politics now. It wasn't to get white racists to vote for that party. It was to cause division between different immigrant and ethnic groups in Canada. The thinking was, well, you didn't like Muslims in the country you came from, so you shouldn't like them here either. And the Muslims were the convenient scapegoat. That's my opinion on what happened there. But this has real ramifications for real people. And this is where I think things get dangerous, you know. I remember a couple of years ago, I was at an international meeting somewhere in Europe, and I gave people a thought example. And it was, if I told you there was a country in which your religion dictated what job you could get, that there was a country in which if you were a woman who wears a hijab, or a Sikh who wears a turban, or an Orthodox Jewish person who wears a kippah, there were certain jobs that were closed to you. Can you imagine there would be such a country? And people would say, oh, Saudi Arabia?
I know, never they
Libya?
say.
And I said,
no.
no, the second largest province in Canada. And we had a situation where this barely came up in our last federal election. And the moment that it did,
People backed off.
when, well, there's more to it than that. It's very deep. The moderator of the national debate was a woman of color. On the stage was a woman of color and a man who wears a turban. The average citizens that they quoted were very rarely people of color, with one exception, Indigenous people who could only ask about Indigenous issues, because Indigenous people only care about Indigenous issues, not about the rest of the country. It was very weird. And when the moderator asked that question, she got so much pushback. No one on the stage, with the exception of Annemie Paul, would defend her. She was herself accused of being discriminatory and racist by asking about discrimination. This is something that happens to people of color in this country every
All the
day.
time.
You are playing the race card. And let me tell you, the race card is never part of a winning hand. And so we really have to come to terms with the fact that these are not others who are racist, who are mean-spirited, who are
That's very
divisive.
toxic for them.
It's our own political power systems that have led to this. And as much as you go to every single ethnic event, as much as you, like my premier, every time you say the word church in a speech, you say, and synagogue, and temple. And every time you say the word priest, you say, and imam, and rabbi. That's not pluralism. That's the very beginning of it. And so we truly have to understand what we're responsible for. And we have to be able to build a political system where it says this is not effective. And so the cowardice of all five parties in not being able to stand up to the Premier of Quebec because they wanted the votes in Quebec, how well did it work for Erin O'Toole when he got Francois Legault's endorsement? He didn't get a single extra seat out of it. What would happen if you cut society in a different way? And you said, as a politician, I'm appealing to the good in people. I'm appealing to the people who want a better society. I don't care if you live in Alberta or Quebec or Ontario. I'm appealing to you because we can build something better for everyone. You know what happens to that person? That person wins an election. And that's why we have to completely change our dialogue and our narrative politically in this country, or we're never going to get out of this.
So, yeah.
It was even more sinister than what Naheed just says, because one doesn't want to be partisan, but the Harper years were the Americanization of Canada. Mr. Harper imported the worst possible Republican tendencies to this country. He introduced Trumpism in Canada long before anyone had heard of Mr. Trump. Namely, he refused to meet the Muslim community. He single-handedly boycotted the Muslim community. The only Muslims he talked to is about 6 people or 12 people who would sing his song. Rest of the Muslim community simply did not exist, period. He boycotted them. And apropos what Naheed was saying, he in fact systematically wooed all those minorities in Canada who had escaped discrimination from Muslim majority countries, namely Coptic Christians from Egypt, Christians from Pakistan, Ahmadis from Pakistan, other minorities from Iran. This country in 150 years, we always used to say, don't import your home country troubles to Canada. And here was a prime minister of the day, in fact, stoking it, and because he wanted their votes.
But here's the thing, right? It didn't work.
It eventually did not work. But
Because when you go to a Gurdwara and you start saying bad things about Muslims, guess what? The Muslim is the next door neighbor of the Sikh.
Exactly.
Right? They're going to make a phone call the next day.
Except the problem is it didn't happen until 2015 when Canadians said, enough. We don't want any more of barbaric cultural act and so on. But in the meantime, the collateral damage has been Muslims and the Muslim communities. And I'll tell you one more ironic thing. You ask a poll, in any poll in Canada you look up, or anywhere in the United States or Europe, what is the thing about Islam and Muslims that bothers you or you talk about? Number one issue, treatment of women is bad. Okay, let's agree it is bad. So what do? The biggest victims of Islamophobia in the Western world are Muslim women.
Absolutely.
Yes, they are.
I mean,
They're
how
visible.
perverse can we get? This is the result of the poison that has been sort of spilled into society.
So when we hear the dog whistle, what's the response? What's the appropriate response? I mean, your response is, education, telling a different story, bringing forward your response is calling the bluff, or just asking for a bit more courage and how do we make sure that people recognize that it's a dog whistle is how we need to get there. Any thoughts on how you build coalitions of the courageous and the coalition of, the coalition, there's a lot of people that are demonstrating in the streets against Bill 21. There's a lot of people that are suing the Quebec government to court several times over. What are the other issues that you think are necessary?
I mean, from my perspective, again, I'm in the arts and culture field rather than naked politics.
Arts and culture is way more political than you.
I was trying to get away with it, but you had to put me on the spot.
Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. But in what we are trying to do in the museum, and I think what is essential throughout, is to find a way to go beyond the polemics. Because at the moment what we are dealing with is populist mudslinging with the brains blown out. And social media and mass media have made that even worse. So when I think about our work in the museum, we again try to take our artworks to empower different conversations around them and create projects that are not only inclusive but also empowering. And the best way we find to do that is actually to bring different people from different backgrounds together and let them work on something they care about together. So rather than doing the them and us approach,
Yes.
we actually look at a project that they can develop together. And we did that with music and film students from Humber College just recently as a case study, who from many different backgrounds came to the museum to learn about our pluralistic mandate, to learn about the artifacts in the collection, work with the master musician, Iranian heritage based in Montreal, and then go away and work together on the basis of what they have learned and compose a new piece for the museum. And
that's-
they went away and started working on that, and then the summer vacation came, and they all went back to their respective countries and got stuck because of different vaccine regimes and kids weren't vaccinated. I don't know what was. So the project was in jeopardy. And what to do? And they decided to continue this project because they had this commitment to each other beyond differences. And they continued this project and the composing and the sharing online with some in Iran, Pakistan, India, somewhere in Africa, can't remember the country, and of course here in Canada. And then the first time that they physically came together to perform this piece was in the museum, which was a fundamentally powerful moment, and they had preambles for each one of the 4 movements that they had composed, which took direct reference not only to their reality in this messed up COVID world, but also what they had learned, how they had realized that across all the different cultural diversities that they were fascinated to learn more about, they actually discovered their universal connections as musicians, as artists, as young people, and their commitment to take this friendship now into a better future.
In a way, that's one of the many examples that we often look at, bringing people together, the Mosaic Institute. Do you think that the younger generations is more able to do this? Or like my question is a little bit, it seems like we've had lots of projects of bringing people together to work. Do we know whether, there are some terrible, very, very graphic attack on Muslim women, do we know whether overall Canadian society, when we do surveys, whether there is a sense a little bit that the pluralism has gotten deep enough, is my question. Is that your, that the children that are in school in these, or working together, I look at my own children and so on, do you think that has happened or not?
It's happening already. We point out the negative things, but we forget the positives. And this is not an artificial balance. You ask Canadians, what is the most important thing to you? They don't say hockey.
No.
They sometimes say Medicare. The number one quality is a pluralism, multiculturalism. We are the only people on the face of this earth that say Constitution is the biggest thing, right? There's something to it. Number one, Charter of Rights and Freedoms and so on. So that is one aspect of it. These are the same people who welcomed 50,000, 60,000 Syrian refugees into this country, These are the same people who, having made the mistake of being complicit, our security agencies were complicit in the case of Mehrara, they were complicit in the case of Omar Khadr, they were complicit in the case of the 3 other Arab Canadians who were tortured in Syria. This was the only country that established a commission, Justice O'Connor to look into the first case, former Justice Yakabuchi to look into the second case. The courts came through on the security certificates. So this is the only country that has been able to make some amends. No European country is doing it. America is certainly not apologizing. So what is it? Martin Luther King used to say, the battle for equality never ends. We must continue. And of course, we have made much improvement.
So what about you, Naheed? How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm tremendously optimistic. I always have to be tremendously optimistic. But I do think that we have to get to a deeper level. The data show quite clearly that the basic concepts of pluralism and multiculturalism are deeply ingrained in Canadians and go deeper. In kids in school, I used to ask when I was a professor, what percentage of Calgary is visible minorities, not white? And younger kids would always say 50, 60%. The answer is about 33%.
Yeah.
But that wasn't their reality. In school and their sports teams and so on, they saw much more of it. But last summer, one of the most interesting conversations I had was with a group of grade 12 students at Western Canada High School, which is a public school in downtown Calgary, one of the best public schools in the country. And these kids have limitless potential. And I just sort of asked them to kind of tell their stories. And it was interesting, because I believe in narrative, and it was interesting to hear how different the stories of the people of color were. And let's not even get into the Indigenous kids or the Black kids from the others in terms of what they saw their own opportunity and potential as. The example I often use is, I said, tell me what happened when you got your driver's license. And I chose a white kid, and I said, tell me about the lecture your parents gave you when you got your driver's license. And the answer was, well, I'm not allowed to speed, I can't have too many friends in the car, obviously no drinking and driving, no drugs and driving, and if I get a scratch on my dad's car and bring it home, I'm in big trouble. Right? And I said, okay, great. And texting's a big thing. Leave your phone in the back seat.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, without the texting part, that's probably the lecture that I got when I got my driver's license. And I pointed out to one of the kids of color and I said, tell me about the lecture you got.
I know.
And the answer was all of that, but also
If you,
take your wallet out before you start the car. Make sure your driver's license is very easily approachable. Don't make any fast moves. If they ask you to get out of the car, get out of the car. Even if it's totally unjust, do not fight. Do not resist. It's more important to come home. That's in Calgary, where we have a police chief who has acknowledged institutional racism in the police force and has talked about all the things he's doing to change that. So you're still getting that lecture. And so what it became clear to me, and an idea that I'm teasing out a little bit in my own thinking, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on, is that for those of us who came to this country, I was born just down the street, St. Mike's Hospital. My mother was pregnant when they came to Canada. So I always say I was born in Canada but made in Africa. But for those of us who have been here, we've kind of made a deal. And sometimes we talk about that deal, and sometimes we don't. And the deal is this: we'll put up with it.
yeah.
We'll put up with extra attention from the security guard at the Walmart. Never mind that he looks like us. We'll put up with having to give the kids the extra lecture. We'll put up with, where are you really from? You speak English so well. We'll put up with, I wonder how she got that promotion. And we'll put up with it because in return, we get to live here. We get to live in a place of limitless possibility for ourselves and for our kids. And for a lot of young people, they're now saying, I didn't
don't.
make that deal.
Yeah, I don't want that.
I don't want that deal. I don't want to put up with it. I don't want to have to explain my hijab every single day. How do we move forward? And so you asked earlier, what do we do? And I keep saying, I don't know the answer. I don't know what the definition of anti-racism is. I don't even know what the journey is. But I think I know where to find the answer. So if you're in Calgary and you've heard me drone on for the last 11 years, regardless of your background, you know one Sanskrit word. And that Sanskrit word is seva.
Yeah.
It means service, selfless service. And I've been talking for many years about how we are all called upon to be sevadari, people who give service. But I actually define that as human beings. And so when I think about the remarkable acts of heroism in our communities that we've seen during the pandemic, that we've seen during times of national crisis, and you mentioned that there were 4 states of emergency since I've been mayor. Correlation does not equal causation to the academics in the room. We know that that's where part of the solution is. So I launched a program, which I'm now relaunching in my retirement, called 3 Things for Canada. It's a very simple program. It simply asks every citizen every year to do at least 3 acts of community service. I know this sounds naive. It sounds very Pollyanna-ish.
No.
But reminding people, because the research also show very clearly that the number one reason people don't get involved in their communities is not I don't have time, it's not I don't have money, it's not I don't have an interest or a passion or I don't know what to do. The number one reason people don't get involved in their communities is nobody asked me. So if we can set the table to say, as Marian Wright Edelman once said, service is the rent we pay to be human beings. If we can set the table and tell people, doing those little acts of service, whether it's shoveling your neighbor's walk or joining a nonprofit board, big or small, that's how we get dialogue started. If we then amplify the acts of service that lead to the kind of anti-racist society we were striving to, that's where we find the solution. So I don't know where it is, but I know where to find it, and it starts in those everyday acts from everyday people.
So service, and service to others, service to all of us, and maybe we can ask whether there are questions coming up in the audience, both here or online. I know that, so if you want to ask a question here, please raise your hand and stand up, and we will bring the mic to you. Yes, Ben.
Thank you for a fascinating panel. I really enjoyed all three of you and your insights. I served as the head of Canada's mission in Kandahar, 2009 to 2010, as the head of the civilian component, so running the development programs and the government reconstruction and police training programs. We were working alongside the military. So the fall of Afghanistan has been a moment of tremendous reflection for me and for my colleagues. There is a lot, I suppose, of negative to come to terms with. The practice of torture, I think, had been firmly put to rest before I got there. But it was a military mission, and with all the complexity that comes with. One observation I'd like to make about that is that there was a lot of us who served in the military, in civilian capacity, in a country that Canada really didn't have that much to do with beforehand, but now we have an awful lot of connection to. We see some of the impact of that in the human-to-human connections and the tremendous outpouring of anxiety and frankly action, civic action, to talk about service. A great example of said, I think, is this the incredible lengths that many Canadians have gone to ensure that Afghans who served with us come home. There's been this outpouring of support. And that points, I think, to some hope that there is a deep connection that many Canadians that don't have a Muslim background now feel very deeply connected to one Muslim land. Now that the military mission, our military mission ended in 2014, the American military mission, the NATO military mission ended in spectacular failure this year, I wonder if there's an opportunity to kind of build on those human connections, firmly put the security in the military mission in the past, in the historical record, for better or for worse, and build on this deep commitment that many individual Canadians have to Afghanistan, looking forward to see if that might become part of the Canadian narrative, that we have made this commitment, whether it was right or wrong, but it's there, and it's a connection that we have with the Muslim world that
I
we could
think you're
build on.
seeing a lot of that happening now. And I think that you see that the response of Canadians to the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015, look, we're all proud of ourselves for taking 25,000 folks by Christmas. We got it by February. It was an awesome thing. It's some of the most touching moments of my life. We're dealing with those new arrivals. Remember that in places like Lebanon, there are millions of folks who have been displaced, right? There are as many refugees in Lebanon as there are people in Lebanon. But at the same time, I think that plus the remarkable response we've had from Canadians for those interpreters, for those folks that worked with us, really shows us that in this case, no one says, oh, are they Muslim? They say they deserve to be Canadian. And so, first of all, let me thank you deeply for your service. I think that I can't imagine what you've been through these last few months. It's impossible for me. Even as an outsider, it's been so hard, so hard. But the one thing that gives me hope is the fact that universally as Canadians, I have not heard one voice say, don't let those people come here, they might be terrorists.
Yeah.
In 2002, we would have heard that everywhere. So that is something I think we can really build on, and it's because of the service of people like you in making those connections.
Yes, there's a.
Oh boy, okay.
Anvaria.
You wanted us to stand, so thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the conversation so far. I'm caught still on the wonderful way you said we have to, Mayor, or former Mayor, that we have to hold two perhaps contradictory notions in our head, the great pride and also the work still to be done. And I have found myself around the world where people have said, oh, Canada, you're doing it so well, et cetera, and I always found myself in that place where it was yes, but, and I kind of moved myself to a yes and. And the way I've done that, and the way I think about it, is that we haven't arrived. This isn't about arriving at an end state of perfection or well done. It's a dynamic. And this dynamic is this incredible experiment that I've called Canada. We're like a massive laboratory on social and economic policy. And it's a dynamic state, and we're always working on it, and some things fail tremendously, and some things we succeed on, so they get added to that left side of the box of, pretty well done, but there's still lots of work to do, and there's no end state. And my question to all of you, and I love the idea of the music and the fusion music, et cetera, but I think because we're out ahead of the rest of the world, and I have worked in almost every country of the world, we are out ahead in what we're trying to do, that we don't actually have anyone to look to for example. And I think one of the things that I find myself struggling with, and I'd love your comments on it, is we don't have the vocabulary yet to describe where we're at. And so people are stumbling over diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism, pluralism, and we're trying to find the language in this kind of post-pluralism world that we're kind of finding ourselves stumbling into. And so music is part of that language, but words are also part of that language. And I think if we can get some vocabulary that will help us through this in recognizing there's no end state, it's dynamic and it's forever, we might find more assurance and confidence. And I'm the eternal optimist too, because I love the dynamic and I love the tension, but it's a laboratory. And there will be failures as well as successes.
You see, we don't really have to worry about phraseology. It is what we do every day.
Absolutely.
This conversation, I can guarantee you, would never take place in France. This open conversation.
Might not take place in Quebec.
Huh?
Yeah.
And it can't take place in Quebec. So these contradictory things that are happening all the time. And Ulrike here is a representative of a museum that is one of the best things that happened to Canada in the post 9/11 period. And a lot of people don't realize what a jewel, what a great architectural and cultural jewel it is. I'm not an Ismaili Canadian, but I'm with other Canadians who admire what has happened here. And Canadian taxpayers did not pay a single cent for it. You know, it was built by the community and by him and everyone else. These are great things that happen in this country. But at the same time, we have institutional kind of problems that Naheed spoke about, everyone speaks about. We have in our audience Professor Anwar Iman, who is a professor of law at University of Toronto. He wrote a paper just a few months ago of how the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, continues to audit Muslim charities. You know, and if you have a moment, I would like you to speak to it, please.
Can
because
I
we
just
all learn from these things.
Can I just respond
Yes, please.
to the lady as well, because what you are saying is a very
You
important.
mean you disagree what I said about the Aga Khan Museum?
Not at all. I'm grateful for the ad. I'm grateful for
You'd
the
probably
ad.
prefer a little bit of government funding. Just make it a little easier.
But speaking to you, what is a great advantage in many people in Canada is the genuine will to continue on that journey. And the best way to embark on that journey or to continue on that journey is to have less and less and less certainties and ask more and more and more questions.
For sure.
Because what sometimes our problem is in the West in general, that we have our cookie cutter opinions and we apply them to other countries without actually knowing them, without actually understanding them. I always remember Anais Nin, and I'm paraphrasing here, she said, we don't see things the way they are. We see things the way we want to see them.
Yeah.
So when you take a topic like the hijab, for example, this is a very, very complex, messy subject that you could take apart over centuries according to cultures, according to different social levels in the very same country. So when you want to have an opinion about this topic, you actually need to understand the individual reasons of women for wearing it. Yes, sometimes it is imposed on them. Often, very often, it is not. And there are many different reasons. But we can take any other topic, and I again think of it in my museum context all the time. You know, let us leave our certainties at the door and ask our opposite, tell me, how is it for you? I want to learn. And when we have that open mind, and actually when we have that empty mind, then we are actually ready to have conversations that are at eye level and that will actually leave us very much enriched. I have one example just because I'm thinking of the Syrian refugees and the dynamic of people taking them in. I remember one specific story from Germany, where I'm originally from, where, if you remember, a few years back, we had this enormous wave of refugees of over 1 million pouring into Germany. And many ordinary Germans immediately opened their doors. And there was one story of an elderly German couple who took in this lone young Syrian man. And they said, we did that because we still remember what it was like to be a refugee during the Second World War, when they were displaced from Eastern Germany into Western Germany. So they took this young man into their house, and he settled, and then he said, where's your family? And the old people said, well, you know, our children have long gone, and they are far away, we hardly ever see them. You are alone? Nobody is looking after you? And he was so shocked, and he said, I will be your family. And he started going shopping for them, to take them out for walks, cook for them, because that is what he was used to from his culture. That you honor your elders, you love your parents, they never leave the heart and soul of the family until they die. So in this encounter between these two cultures, the Syrian gentleman actually enriched the existence of this lonely old German couple. So in these kind of encounters, there is so much learning and so much potential if you are open to the encounter, to the conversation, and also to the complexities that for sure come with it.
If it brings me, and I know that Enbron wants to speak a little bit about this, it seemed to me also that when we open up conversations on a journey, there will be more disturbing conversations ahead. You know, when you start asking women to speak about violence against women, then they speak about violence against women, and you know, and then they discover their own language that they needed to own, to actually come to, and then you have a further conversation, and then it's so my sense is that, beginning from the conversation that you had with the two groups, you know, it's healthy that now young people would say, I'm not tolerating the idea that so it's maybe it's a sign of progress that now they feel comfortable to say, I'm not bound by the old rules. I want this country to be better, and I deserve it, and also I will contribute to
demand it.
I demand it, and that's what we want. That's the empowerment that you want. The worst thing in discrimination is when people internalize the discrimination and stop asking. But Enver, talk about the charities that are no longer, you know, are being suspicious.
I wanted to ask if it's okay. So thank you for the shout out on the report. But it raises a question on Islamophobia, because oftentimes we think of Islamophobia as, you know, two guys on the street kind of duking it out. We think of it as citizen between citizen, and the government is absent in the conversation, or is the neutral umpire. But what happens if it's not? So, you know, what we were able to find in our report was that, according to Finance Canada, it identified for counterterrorism financing purposes 10 groups that are the greatest threat to terrorist financing in Canada. Of the 10, one's Sikh, one's Tamil, and 8 are Muslim identified, which means formal policy of the government of Canada, not a politician, not an elected official, but of the bureaucracy, is that 100% of terrorist financing risk in Canada comes from racial and religious minorities. That's a problem on its face. But because it's a whole of government policy, that means that affects CSIS, that affects RCMP, that affects the CRA, that affects every ministry that has any charge of that. So my question really is, in the context of that report, which is now raising a whole other set of questions around not just Islamophobia, but government-enabled Islamophobia, what do you do with an Islamophobia that is normalized as a form of bureaucratic rationality? Because that's what we're seeing at the institute that I direct, is whether it's CSIS, the metrics, the modes of risk assessment, where you allocate resources to identify where the greatest threats are, they're all focused on racialized minorities, and in particular Muslims, with respect to national security. Now, that's the problem. And in our case, we're looking at civil society organizations that are trying to do good by their communities. And if we measure democratic possibility by reference to robustness of civil society, it doesn't come out looking very well for us. And so that's the question I want to pose to all of you is, how do you address Islamophobia when it's embedded in government rationality?
The number one rule of understanding government is never attribute to bureaucratic malice what can be explained by bureaucratic incompetence. And so I would suggest, I mean, that's very shocking things that you're saying, but I would suggest what one needs to do is ask, where does that come from? Does it come from an ingrained Islamophobia? Or does it come from, I don't know the field, so I'm just making things up, but does it come from the fact that a lot of radical right-wing terrorism is frankly not very well funded? It's more lone wolf stuff, and there aren't organizations that you can find as easily. That doesn't excuse the work, it doesn't excuse it at all. But I think in understanding where that came from is how you find the solution. Because if we start with the presumption that this came from an Islamophobic mindset that led to this bureaucracy, you'll end up in a very different place than if you start with the presumption that the bureaucracy did this and that led to an Islamophobic action. And so I don't know the answer in this case, it's not my field, but I think that is really the question that you'd have to start with.
Denouncing it, I assume, is the
That's
other-
also important, yes.
You know,
Doing the research is really important.
Yeah, and shining a light.
Because I'm sure that the vast majority of people within the bureaucracy were shocked by the results of your paper and are asking themselves some very tough questions now.
Yes, there was other questions there. Yeah, 2 more questions, I think, and then we're getting to, those are the last 2 questions. And I'll ask you just to wrap up with having, what do you want people to remember from today? Just
Pankaj.
Thank you, Aga. My name is Pankaj. Thank you very much for a very all-encompassing discussion, which is threaded in so many different dialogues and so many different problems, provided some partial solutions. In addition to what this gentleman just talked about, embedded racism, anecdotally, I have experienced that when immigrants are coming in, and especially when immigrants are coming in large numbers, they also bring some of their, I would hate to use the word prejudice, but you know, whatever their experiences are from their home country, they bring it together over here. And increasingly, I find in our conversations with certain communities, they'll start off by saying, oh, I have, you know, don't get me wrong, I have nothing against the Muslims. I've got very good friends who are Muslims, and that mindset is being translated to their kids. They might outgrow that themselves, but the kids are getting influenced by some negative thinking. It's causing mental problems as well among the youth. I don't know what the answers are, but what can we do to address some of those issues?
They're doing what the English and the French did, and brought their prejudices, and it lasted for a long time. We still have the effects of them. Every people from everywhere bring their prejudices and values. People cannot develop amnesia the moment they land on this soil. It's a matter of time. Professor Kimlicka at Queen's University, who is a leading expert on multiculturalism, he says the longer they live in Canada, the more they absorb the values of Canada and Canadianism and charter. It's a matter of time, you know, and all we can do as a public entity and public service and a public policy is that your private prejudices are private. They ought not to enter the public arena. They ought not to enter public policy. And when you do the function, a public function, as a police officer, as a CRA member, as a government, and so on and so forth, leave your prejudices at home. If you don't, you will be in trouble. That is the role of government. That's the role of public policy. That's the role of public opinion. And this is too last minute, I did not think about it. One of the biggest culprits in all of this is my own profession, the media.
Yes.
You know, we have been fanning Islamophobia since 2001. We do not follow any of the general rules that we have always followed. This is one of the greatest and saddest part of my life, is that my own profession has let Canada down. I expect that from Fox News, but I don't expect it in Toronto, you know.
Yeah.
One last question and then.
Myself, Narendra. So, a few years ago, I gave a talk at Graduate Institute in Geneva, where I basically proposed the most significant philosophical problem of 21st century is who is the Muslim. And I began with the work of Primo Levi. And it goes into this very important element which you alluded to in terms of vocabulary, the idea of language, because that shapes our relationship with reality. We have to accept it. We live in a lot of, with settled consensus and recited truths. It's difficult to undo them easily within the political framework or with certain kind of understandings. The idea of Musalman, so to say, more in a conceptual sense, is it's still approached from a Cold War paradigm. I mean, Professor Mamdani has very well articulated that in terms of good Muslim and bad Muslim.
Good Muslim and bad Muslim.
Yeah. And that is what exactly is going on, even till now. And when it comes to idea of suddenly the conflation of Islamophobia, diversity, anti-terrorist into another category of things, is like using these things as figure of speech, as if they are just like, you know, decolonization is like a metaphor. No, these things are not, and that's where the idea of language becomes very important. Like diversity and inclusion, these terms, that stems from something called Rand Corporation report in 1987, which has nothing to do with racism, diversity, or even inclusion. It is a productivity tool, for goodness sake. But it is taken at face value. So what I'm trying to say is that's where the idea of language becomes so fundamental in terms of grappling with the reality that we are all facing. Okay, so I thought of just keeping it as a comment rather than a question to.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, it's a great way to end about how we're going to use the right language to actually encapsulate this rich conversation. So let's start with you, Haroon. I'll go, you know.
No, we just keep trying and we keep saying, thank God we are Canadian. As simple as that.
Simple as that.
Just keep trying.
Keep trying.
I
Ulrike.
would say don't have all the answers, rather ask all the questions.
Very good.
That's a good one.
They're so succinct, and you're ending with me. Oh.
Well, I knew you needed a little bit more time.
Well, I'm loving having this conversation, but I must say that although I am an academic, I'm a very bad academic because I get impatient in terms of just making sure we're trying things. So to this question of language, I will tell you that I am using the term anti-racism a lot now. And I'm trying to develop a vocabulary around anti-racism that takes us beyond equity, diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism, and pluralism. Again, but I don't know what it means. I'm deliberately using a phrase that I don't know what it means. Maybe I am a good academic. But I do it on purpose. But I think that the point that we have to make is, and I've heard it on a lot of the thread that people are talking about, look, if the world was more like Canada, it would be a better world. But that cannot allow us to be smug. It cannot allow us to sit and say, just be more like us, world. We've got to take those uncertain and frightening steps that will lead to, as you were saying earlier, that will lead to discomfort for us, because things we think are just fine aren't. But if we're willing to take those steps, if we're willing to do so in a mindset of service, then that ultimately will guide us to a brighter future. It has to. You know, I had an old professor, Dr. Ron Glassberg, who used to talk about the cyclical nature of time. And I'm sure I'm going to misquote his concept, because also a poor student. But he talked about how times of great tension can be followed by times of transcendence. So we haven't talked about the public health pandemic during all of this, so I'll finish with that. Simply by saying what has happened to us over the last 20 months has upended all of our expectations about how our society works, about what it means to be a citizen. So let's use that. Let's take this moment where the clay is wet and mold a stronger future before it sets. This is a time for us to reach that transcendence.
Merci beaucoup. What a fabulous way of ending this dialogue. I want to thank you, all the audience, for your participation here, and I certainly want to thank my three guests. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all.